an archaeologist deciphers an ancient tablet. It's not a prayer, but a terrifying instruction on how to stop time. He enjoys his power, walking through a city of frozen people, the only living thing in a silent world. Until he sees it. Across a frozen square, a tall figure in a dark coat starts walking. And it's walking directly towards him. Dr. Alastair Finch leaned over the clay tablet, and the world shrank to the size of his desk lamp's dusty cone of light. His universe was now composed entirely of cracked ochre clay and the dense, wedge-shaped impressions of a long-dead language. For 3 weeks he had inhabited this small, cluttered office, a voluntary exile from the sun, from conversation, from the very concept of a world that was not 4,000 years old. His colleagues saw his closed door and assumed he was on the verge of a breakthrough. They did not understand he was on the edge of a precipice. The obsession had consumed him completely, fueled by stale coffee and the electrifying thrill of a truly unique discovery. He had forgotten to eat, had slept in his chair, his dreams filled with the angular, alien grammar of the Sumerians. The dust of the ancient world seemed to have settled not just on the artifacts surrounding him, but on his own clothes, in his unkempt hair, a fine, pale powder that marked him as a man out of time. He was no longer just studying the past, he was beginning to feel as if he were a part of it, a lonely scribe in a forgotten temple. The tablet, unearthed during a dig near the ruins of Ur, was an anomaly. It was not a record of grain transactions, not a hymn to the moon god Nana, not a king's boastful inscription. It was a text of an entirely different order, its structure logical, sequential, and deeply instructional. It read less like a prayer and more like a technical manual, a precise and esoteric schematic for a piece of technology that the ancient world could not have possibly possessed. It was a set of instructions, and after weeks of painstaking work, he was finally beginning to understand what they were for. Night fell, and the university building settled into a deep and profound silence, the distant hum of the city a mere whisper against the thick stone walls. It was in this perfect, tomb-like quiet that he knew he had to try. The final line of the text, the key to the entire operation, was now clear to him. It was not a theory to be published in a dusty academic journal, it was an experiment to be conducted. A terrible, thrilling, and possibly world-altering experiment. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the air thick with the scent of old paper and his own nervous sweat. He spoke the final, most complex word aloud. The sound was a harsh, guttural rasp, a collection of phonemes not meant for a modern throat. It felt alien in his own mouth, a linguistic trespass, the verbal equivalent of touching a sacred, forbidden object. And in that instant, in the profound and sudden silence that followed the word's echo, everything stopped. The change was not loud or violent. It was a quiet, absolute, and total cessation. The world had not ended. It had simply, and completely, paused. The pendulum of the old regulator clock on the wall, which had been marking the slow, inexorable passage of his wasted life, froze at the very apex of its swing, a silent, brass teardrop defying gravity. The reassuring, rhythmic tick-tock that had been the constant soundtrack to his lonely work was gone, its absence a deafening roar in the sudden, perfect stillness. The concept of time, of a future moment following a past one, had been suspended by a single, ancient, and perfectly pronounced word. A single drop of rain, which had been sliding a slow, meandering path down the grimy windowpane, hung suspended in the middle of the glass, its tiny, distorted reflection of the room held in a perfect, liquid stasis. It was a liquid jewel, a captured moment of motion that was no longer in motion. The relentless, gentle rhythm of the storm outside had been muted, each subsequent drop of rain now a fixed, unmoving point in the darkness, a frozen, silent curtain of water hanging between his office and the rest of the world. Even the universe of the small had been arrested. A single mote of dust, which had been dancing a chaotic, joyful ballet in the cone of his desk lamp, was now poised in the air, a tiny, stationary planet in a beam of frozen light. It was the final, definitive proof. He had not just stopped the clocks. He had stopped everything. He was sitting in the exact center of a single, perfect, and frozen moment in time, the sole, conscious observer in a world that had, at his command, collectively and completely, held its breath. For 37 seconds, by the frantic, silent count of his own terrified heart, the world remained in a state of perfect, frozen suspension. Then, as suddenly and as silently as it had stopped, it returned. The clock's pendulum completed its swing with a loud, definitive tick. The raindrop on the windowpane finished its journey, merging with the pool of water on the sill. The mote of dust, its brief moment of celestial stillness over, fell out of the lamplight and disappeared into the shadows. The world had exhaled, and the normal, linear flow of time had resumed its relentless, indifferent course. Alistair sat motionless, his own body the only thing that had not returned to its normal state. His heart was a frantic, trapped bird, beating a wild, painful rhythm against the cage of his ribs. His hands were clenched into tight, white-knuckled fists on the surface of his desk. His breathing was a series of short, shallow gasps, his lungs struggling to process the suddenly moving air. It could not have happened. It was a hallucination, a waking dream, a momentary lapse in his own, exhausted consciousness. It was a fiction, a story his sleep-deprived brain had told itself in the deep, dark silence of the night. He spent the rest of the night in a state of agitated paralysis, caught between the rational, scientific mind that insisted it was a dream, and the terrified, primal part of him that knew, with an absolute and unshakable certainty, that it was not. He tried to rationalize it, to build a wall of logic against the encroaching, impossible truth. It was a microsleep, a brief, unremembered lapse into unconsciousness. It was a fugue state, brought on by weeks of stress and poor nutrition. It was an illusion, born of the dust and the solitude and the hypnotic, repetitive patterns of the ancient text. But he was a scientist. He dealt in evidence, in repeatable experiments, in objective, verifiable proof. A hallucination was a one-time event. A repeatable hallucination was a phenomenon. He had to know. He had to test the hypothesis. The next day, he left the dusty, hermetic confines of his office and re-entered the living, breathing, and, most importantly, moving world. He went to the city's main public library, a vast, echoing cathedral of knowledge, a place filled with the random, chaotic, and beautifully unpredictable movements of other human beings. It was the perfect laboratory for his next, terrifying experiment. He found a small, isolated table in a far corner of the reading room, a quiet, secluded spot where he would not be easily observed. He sat down, his hands trembling slightly, and took out his phone. He opened the gallery, the bright, modern screen a jarring anachronism in the staid, old-world atmosphere of the library. He scrolled through the images until he found it, a high-resolution photograph of the tablet, its cuneiform script a dense, alien thicket of lines and wedges. He leaned in close, his face just inches from the screen, and he lowered his voice to a barely audible whisper. He spoke the words. The same harsh, guttural phrase that had echoed in the silence of his office the night before. And the world stopped. The effect, in the context of the bustling, populated library, was 100 times more profound, more dramatic, and more terrifying than it had been in his empty, silent office. The gentle, ambient hum of the library, the rustle of turning pages, the distant cough, the soft, rhythmic stamp of the librarian's date marker, was instantly extinguished, replaced by a silence so absolute, so complete, that it felt like a physical pressure against his eardrums. The librarian, a stern-looking woman with her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, was frozen behind the main desk, her hand, holding the rubber date stamp, poised in the air, a single, perfect millimeter above the page of an open book. Her expression was one of mild, professional concentration, a look that would now be held, perhaps for all eternity, in a state of perfect, uninterrupted stasis. Her universe had been paused in the middle of a single, mundane, and now immortal act of bureaucratic procedure. A young woman sitting at the table opposite him was frozen in the middle of a blink, her eyelids half closed, a delicate, feathery fringe of eyelashes hovering just above her cheekbones. Her posture was a perfect, candid portrait of intellectual absorption, a moment of deep, thoughtful concentration that was now a permanent, and slightly unsettling, part of the room's new, static decor. The normal, fluid, and unconscious act of blinking had been interrupted, a single, delicate moment of human biology captured and held in a state of suspended animation. Near a row of bookshelves, a young man, a student by the looks of him, had stumbled, his foot catching on the leg of a chair. He was now hanging in the air, a perfect, and slightly comical, sculpture of arrested motion. His body was tilted at an impossible, gravity-defying angle, his arms thrown out for a balance he would now never achieve. The folder he had been carrying had flown from his grasp, its contents, a collection of loose-leaf papers, now a perfect, frozen fan of white, suspended in the air a few inches from the floor, each page a separate, unmoving element in a single, chaotic, and now permanent composition. Alistair sat at the center of this silent, frozen world, the only conscious, moving thing in a vast, and suddenly terrifying, museum of captured moments. He was not a scientist conducting an experiment. He was a god, a lonely, terrified god who had just discovered the terrible, absolute, and profoundly isolating nature of his own, newfound power. The initial thrill of his discovery, the intellectual excitement of the deciphered text, was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp, and deeply existential fear. He was utterly, completely, and, for the first time in his life, truly alone. And in the profound, absolute silence of his own, private, and frozen universe, he began to feel the first, faint, and deeply unsettling sensation of being watched. The initial, sharp-edged fear began to dull, worn down by the sheer, intoxicating novelty of his newfound ability. The profound, existential dread of his absolute solitude slowly, almost imperceptibly, transmuted into a heady, exhilarating sense of power. He was not just an observer of this frozen world, he was its master, its sole and undisputed god. The ancient Sumerian text was not a curse, it was a gift, a key that unlocked a secret, private dimension, a world that was his, and his alone, to explore and to command. He began to experiment, his scientific curiosity now completely untethered from the ethical and practical constraints of the normal, moving world. He left the hushed, reverent silence of the library and took his experiment out onto the loud, chaotic, and beautifully complex stage of the city streets. He would find a crowded intersection, a bustling plaza, a river of human activity, and he would whisper the words. And the world, in all its glorious, multifaceted motion, would instantly, obediently, and completely stop. The cacophony would cease, the motion would halt, and he would be left standing in a silent, three-dimensional photograph of a single, perfect moment in time. He walked among the frozen cars, their drivers sealed in their metal and glass boxes, their expressions a perfect, candid gallery of urban frustration, boredom, and impatience. He peered into the faces of pedestrians, caught in the middle of a word, a laugh, a yawn. He could study the minute, unconscious twitches of a human expression, the subtle, fleeting emotions that were normally lost in the blur of constant motion. He was a sociologist with the ultimate research tool, a portrait artist with an infinite supply of perfectly still, and utterly unwitting, models. His initial explorations were purely observational, a detached, scientific cataloging of the frozen world. But soon, his newfound godhood began to demand a more active, participatory role. He began to interact with his frozen kingdom, performing small, secret, and initially benevolent acts of divine intervention. He saw a woman, her face a mask of cold, her scarf blown back by a wind that was no longer blowing, and he gently, carefully, rearranged the fabric, tucking it snugly around her neck. She would never know of his kindness, but he would. It was a secret, intimate act of compassion. He saw a man, running for a bus that would now never arrive, his wallet in the process of slipping from the pocket of his coat. The wallet was frozen in midair, a perfect, leather rectangle suspended an inch from the pavement. Alistair calmly walked over, plucked the wallet from the air, and tucked it securely back into the man's pocket. It was a small, simple act, but it filled him with a profound sense of satisfaction. He was a guardian angel, a silent, unseen protector, a ghost of kindness haunting the frozen moments of other people's lives. He reveled in his power, in his absolute uniqueness. He was the only living, breathing, and moving thing in a world of exquisitely detailed wax figures. He could study the world in its most intimate, its most vulnerable, its most unguarded state. He could walk into a crowded cafe and read the open pages of a dozen different newspapers, a dozen different lives. He could stand in the middle of a heated argument and study the expressions of pure, unadulterated rage on the frozen faces of the participants. He was a voyeur with the ultimate backstage pass to the human condition. The feeling was intoxicating, a powerful, addictive drug that he could not, and did not want to, resist. The dusty, solitary world of his academic career, with its petty rivalries and its slow, incremental progress, now seemed like a distant, monochrome dream. This was real. This was power. This was life, a secret, vibrant, and utterly private life that he lived in the spaces between the ticks of the clock. He was no longer just Dr. Alistair Finch, a lonely, overlooked academic. He was the lord of the pause, the master of the stillness, the solitary king of a silent, frozen kingdom. And it was in this state of euphoric, godlike intoxication, this profound and deeply satisfying absorption in his own, unique power, that he at first failed to notice the inconsistencies. They were small, fleeting, and easily dismissed. A flicker of movement at the very edge of his vision, a shadow that seemed to shift and reform when he wasn't looking directly at it. He dismissed it as an optical illusion, a trick of the light, the afterimage of a world that his brain knew should be in motion. It was a phantom, a ghost of movement in a world that was, by his own command, perfectly, absolutely still. Then there was the feeling. A subtle, creeping, and deeply unsettling sensation that he was not, in fact, alone in his frozen world. It was not a sound, not a sight, but a feeling, a primal, instinctual awareness of another presence. It was the feeling one gets when walking through a dark, empty house, the irrational but persistent certainty that one is being watched from the shadows. He would be standing in the middle of a crowded, frozen street, surrounded by hundreds of inert, lifeless bodies, and he would feel a sudden, inexplicable chill, a sense of a gaze upon his back. He would spin around, his heart suddenly pounding in his chest, but there would be nothing there. Just more frozen people, more silent cars, more unmoving, inanimate objects. He dismissed it as paranoia, a psychological side effect of his profound and unnatural solitude. His mind, starved of any real, interactive human contact, was simply inventing a companion, a phantom to populate the vast, empty spaces of his new, silent reality. It was a ghost of his own making, a product of his own, increasingly fragile, and deeply isolated psyche. But the feeling persisted, and it began to grow stronger, more insistent, with each new journey he took into the stillness. The initial, euphoric thrill of his power began to be tinged with a faint, underlying note of dread. The silent, frozen world, which had at first felt like his own, private playground, was beginning to feel less like a kingdom and more like a hunting ground. And he was no longer certain that he was the only hunter. The shadows at the edge of his vision seemed to be growing longer, darker, and more substantial. And the feeling of being watched was beginning to feel less like a product of his own paranoia and more like a simple, and terrifying, statement of fact. He was standing in the center of the city's main plaza, a vast, open space teeming with the chaotic, vibrant energy of 1,000 intersecting lives. He had chosen this spot deliberately, a grand stage for his most ambitious experiment yet. He took a deep breath, the air thick with the smells of street food and exhaust fumes, and he whispered the words. The world stopped. The cacophony of the city, the rumble of traffic, the distant wail of a siren, the murmur of 100 conversations, was instantly extinguished, replaced by a profound and absolute silence. The vibrant, moving tapestry of the plaza was now a single, frozen, exquisitely detailed photograph. He began to walk through his silent kingdom, a solitary god strolling through a frozen moment of his own creation. Everything was perfect in its stillness. A flock of pigeons, which had been taking flight in a sudden, noisy explosion of feathers, now hung suspended in the air, a scattered constellation of gray, avian sculptures. The grand fountain in the center of the plaza was a magnificent, crystalline tree, its plumes of water frozen into impossible, gravity-defying branches of glass. The hundreds of people who populated the square were a gallery of candid, unposed statues, each one a perfect, poignant portrait of a life interrupted. He was completely absorbed in the beauty and the strangeness of it all, his earlier anxieties momentarily forgotten in the sheer, overwhelming spectacle of the frozen world. He was a tourist in a dead city, an archaeologist of the present moment, and he was reveling in the infinite, intricate details of the scene. He was so focused on the small, human dramas playing out in the frozen faces around him that he almost missed it. It was a flicker of movement, a slight, almost imperceptible shift in the far distance, a single, discordant note in the otherwise perfect, silent symphony of the frozen world. He stopped, his head snapping up, his eyes scanning the far side of the plaza. He told himself it was just a trick of the light, an afterimage, his brain playing its usual, phantom limb games with the concept of motion. But then he saw it again, and this time, there was no ambiguity. It was not a flicker. It was a figure. A single, solitary figure, standing near the dark, gaping entrance to the subway station, 100 yards away. And the figure was moving. In a world where every other living thing was a perfect, motionless statue, this one, single figure was alive. It was a tall, indistinct silhouette, its form blurred by the distance, its features obscured by the deep, unnatural shadows of the frozen world. It was wearing a long, dark overcoat, its shape heavy and funereal against the bright, midday sun that was no longer moving across the sky. It was not running, not hurrying. It was walking, its pace slow, deliberate, and unervingly calm. It moved with a fluid, inexorable grace, a river of motion in a world of frozen, solid ice. And it was walking directly, and with an unmistakable sense of purpose, toward him. The blood in Alistair's veins turned to ice. The euphoric, godlike sense of power he had felt just moments before evaporated in an instant, replaced by a cold, sharp, and deeply primal fear. The feeling of being watched was no longer a vague, paranoid suspicion. It was a confirmed, empirical fact. He was not alone. The silent, frozen world that he had thought of as his own private kingdom was, in fact, a shared territory. There was another inhabitant of the stillness, another entity that was immune to the power of the ancient Sumerian words. And this other inhabitant, this silent, walking shadow, was not a fellow explorer. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, an ancient, instinctual knowledge that was older and more powerful than his own, modern, scientific mind. The figure was not coming to greet him. It was coming for him. It was a predator, a native of this silent, frozen dimension, and he, with his loud, clumsy, and arrogant intrusions, was the interloper, the trespasser, the prey. His whispered words had not just been a key to a secret world, they had been a dinner bell. Panic, pure and unthinking, seized him. He did not wait to see the figure's face, did not wait for it to get any closer. He did the only thing he could think of to do. He broke the spell. He did not need the tablet to do so, the connection was a two-way street, a mental switch he could now flip at will. He screamed in the silence of his own mind, a frantic, desperate command for the world to return, for the comforting, chaotic noise of reality to drown out the terrifying, silent purpose of the approaching figure. And the world, in an instant, obeyed. The silence was shattered by a deafening roar, the sudden, violent return of 1,000 ambient sounds. The traffic, the conversations, the fountain, the pigeons, it all came rushing back in a chaotic, disorienting wave of noise and motion. The frozen, silent photograph was replaced by the vibrant, messy, and beautifully chaotic film of real life. The crowd surged around him, a river of oblivious, moving bodies, and in that sudden, chaotic flood of normalcy, the figure was gone. It had vanished, dissolved back into the crowd, erased by the return of linear, sequential time. But Alistair knew it was not gone for good. It was just waiting. He stood in the middle of the now moving plaza, his body trembling, a cold sweat slicking his skin, a single, stationary island in the flowing river of the crowd. He was no longer a god. He was a hunted man. The beautiful, silent world of the pause was not a kingdom, it was a trap. A shared space. A hunting ground. And he, with his arrogant, whispered words, had just revealed his location to the other, more ancient, and infinitely more patient hunter. He was no longer the only player in the game. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the very marrow of his bones, that the other player had just seen his face. The power had become a curse. The intoxicating, godlike thrill of the frozen world was gone, replaced by a cold, persistent, and deeply personal terror. The ancient Sumerian words were no longer a key to a secret kingdom, they were a lure, a beacon, a signal fire that he lit in the darkness, and something was now answering its call. The exhilarating sense of freedom he had felt in the stillness had been replaced by the chilling, claustrophobic certainty of being hunted. The silent, frozen world was no longer his playground, it was a vast, and increasingly small, cage. He couldn't resist the urge to check. It was a morbid, self-destructive compulsion, the need to confirm that the predator was still there, still on his trail. He would find a quiet, secluded alleyway, his heart pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm in his chest, and he would whisper the words. The world would stop, the silence would descend, and he would scan the frozen landscape, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a strange, desperate hope that this time, it would be empty. But it was never empty. The figure was always there. And with each new, terrifying observation, it was closer. The first time after the plaza, it was a block away, a tall, dark, and indistinct shape standing at the far end of a frozen street. The next time, a few days later, it was half a block away, its form a little clearer, its purpose a little more defined. It was a slow, patient, and inexorable pursuit, a game of cat and mouse played across a silent, frozen, and infinitely large chessboard. And he was the mouse, a terrified, scurrying creature, and the cat was a silent, patient, and utterly relentless shadow. He realized, with a dawning, soul-crushing horror, that the figure did not exist in the normal, moving world. He would stop time, see the figure, and then, in a blind panic, release the spell, and it would be gone, vanished into the chaotic, moving fabric of reality. It was a creature of the pause, a native of the stillness, an entity that could only exist, could only move, in the frozen, temporal vacuum that he himself created. It was his own personal demon, a ghost he summoned every time he used his accursed, newfound power. He was not just its prey, he was its anchor, its gateway into a world it could not otherwise touch. His whispered words were not just a signal of his location, they were the very key that unlocked its cage, that allowed it to step out of whatever dark, silent dimension it normally inhabited and into his own, private, and now terrifying world. It was a parasite, and he was the host, and every time he stopped the world, he was feeding it, nourishing it, giving it another opportunity to draw closer, to shorten the distance between the hunter and the hunted. The only way to survive, he finally understood, was to starve the beast. The only way to escape the relentless, silent pursuit was to never, ever open the door to its cage again. He had to renounce his power. He had to give up his godhood. He had to willingly, and permanently, return to the slow, boring, and beautifully safe world of the mundane. He had to become just another mortal, just another cog in the vast, indifferent, and wonderfully predictable machine of linear time. It was the only way to become invisible again. He fled back to his office, the dusty, cluttered room that had been the genesis of his power and his terror. It was no longer a sanctuary of knowledge, it was the scene of a crime, a cursed place, the antechamber to his own, personal hell. He opened the heavy, steel safe in the corner of the room, the one where he had so proudly and so foolishly stored the source of his obsession. He looked at the clay tablet, its ancient, wedge-shaped script now seeming less like a language and more like the tracks of a venomous, and infinitely patient, spider. He did not smash the tablet. To do so would be to admit its power, to engage with it on its own, supernatural terms. Instead, he simply left it there, in the dark, silent tomb of the safe, and he closed the heavy door, spinning the combination lock with a final, definitive click. The knowledge was contained. The curse was locked away. Then, he gathered up all his notes, his translations, his frantic, excited scribblings from the early days of his discovery, and he took them to the small, metal incinerator in the university's basement. He watched as the flames consumed the pages, turning his brilliant, world-altering discovery into a plume of gray, greasy smoke. He was not just burning paper, he was burning the last 3 weeks of his life. He was performing a ritual of erasure, a desperate, fiery exorcism of the knowledge that had almost cost him his sanity, and perhaps, his soul. He was unlearning, undiscovering, a scientist frantically, and with a profound sense of relief, embracing ignorance. He was returning to the blissful, safe, and beautifully unenlightened state of not knowing. When the last of the pages had turned to ash, he returned to his office. He locked the door, leaving the key in the lock on the inside, a final, symbolic act of sealing the tomb. He would never enter this room again. He would tell the department head that he was taking a sabbatical, that he was suffering from burnout, that he needed to get away. He would create a new, boring, and beautifully mundane life for himself, a life without ancient texts, without frozen moments, without silent, pursuing shadows. He walked away from the office, from the university, from the entire life he had built for himself, and he did not look back. He walked home through the bustling, noisy, and wonderfully chaotic streets of the city, and for the first time in weeks, he did not feel the urge to stop it. He reveled in its noise, in its motion, in its beautiful, messy, and wonderfully unpredictable reality. He was just another face in the crowd again, another anonymous, insignificant, and gloriously, wonderfully safe human being. He would go home, he would lock his door, he would go to sleep, and the nightmare, at last, would be over. He fell into a deep and dreamless sleep, a profound, leaden unconsciousness that was the final, welcome culmination of weeks of accumulated exhaustion. His last conscious thought was one of profound, bone-deep relief. He was safe. The door was locked. The knowledge was burned. The curse was contained. Sleep, the most natural, ancient, and universal form of sensory deprivation, of switching off the observer's consciousness, would be his final, healing sanctuary. The nightmare was over. He was, at last, blessedly, and completely, at peace. And outside the window of his small, second-floor apartment, the world stopped. The low, distant rumble of late-night traffic ceased. The gentle, rustling sigh of the wind in the trees that lined the street fell silent. The scattered, lonely lights in the windows of the opposite building, which had been a comforting, twinkling constellation of other, separate lives, froze and became a fixed, unblinking, and dead-eyed stare. He had not spoken the words. He had not willed it to happen. But his sleeping mind, now untethered from the moorings of his conscious, rational control, had done it for him. The pause was no longer his to command. The state of stillness was not a tool he could choose to use or to ignore. It was a state of being, a dimension that was inextricably and now permanently linked to his own consciousness. And the act of sleeping, of willingly, and naturally, switching off the observer, was the most powerful, and the most inviting, of all the triggers. He had not escaped the curse. He had simply, and with a profound and tragic irony, taken it home with him. He had not locked it in his office. He had carried it inside his own, sleeping mind. The figure in the long, dark coat was northwest longer on the street below. It was in the room with him. It stood in the far corner of his bedroom, a tall, silent, and featureless column of shadow in the pale, frozen moonlight that now streamed, unmoving, through his window. The slow, patient pursuit was over. The hunter had finally reached its destination. The final, intimate, and deeply personal stage of the hunt was about to begin. The figure was no longer a distant, indistinct silhouette. It was a solid, tangible, and terrifyingly real presence. It moved. With a slow, silent, and utterly fluid grace, it detached itself from the shadows of the corner and began to glide across the room. Its feet made no sound on the worn, wooden floorboards. It was a perfect, and perfectly silent, predator. It moved toward the bed, a river of darkness flowing through the still, frozen air of the bedroom. It reached the side of the bed and stood there for a long, silent moment, looking down at his sleeping, and utterly vulnerable, form. He was a specimen pinned to a board, an insect in a jar, a sleeping, oblivious lamb in the presence of a silent, and infinitely patient, wolf. It did not harm him. It did not touch him. It did not wake him from his deep, and now permanent, sleep. It simply watched him, its unseen, featureless face a mask of calm, dispassionate, and deeply ancient contemplation. It was not a creature of rage or of malice. It was a creature of purpose. And its purpose was not to destroy him, but to join him. It had not been hunting him to kill him. It had been hunting him to find him. It had been answering a call, a summons, a lonely, 4,000-year-old invitation that he, in his arrogant, academic pride, had been the first to read, and to accept. Then, its long, silent vigil over, it began to change. Its solid, humanoid form began to waver, to soften, to lose its definition. It dissolved, not into dust, but into a thick, oily, and perfectly black smoke. The column of shadow that had been a man in a long, dark coat was now a writhing, silent pillar of pure, animate darkness. And this pillar, this sentient, ancient smoke, began to drift downward, toward the sleeping, and utterly defenseless, form of Dr. Alastair Finch. It moved toward his slightly parted lips, the open, trusting, and unconscious gateway to his very soul. The black, oily smoke did not billow or dissipate. It flowed. In a slow, steady, and deeply invasive stream, it poured itself into his open mouth, a river of ancient, conscious darkness flowing into the empty, sleeping vessel of the modern, rational man. It was a possession, a merging, a final, and deeply intimate, act of communion. He did not choke. He did not stir. His deep, dreamless sleep continued, uninterrupted, as the last of the ancient, shadowy form was absorbed into his body, a perfect, silent, and total integration of the hunter and the hunted. The invitation had been accepted. The rendezvous was complete. Dr. Alastair Finch awoke the next morning. The sun was streaming through his window, the sounds of the city were a familiar, comforting murmur, and the world was, once again, blessedly, and beautifully, in motion. He felt wonderful. He felt rested, renewed, and filled with a strange, new, and deeply unfamiliar sense of quiet, confident purpose. The fear, the anxiety, the paranoia of the last few weeks, it was all gone, a distant, foolish memory of a lesser, more fragile version of himself. He felt a profound sense of peace, a sense of a deep, internal, and long-awaited wholeness. He got out of bed and walked to the bathroom. He looked at his own reflection in the mirror, at the familiar, academic, and slightly tired face of a middle-aged man. His eyes, his own, familiar, blue eyes, looked back at him. But the gaze was different. It was not the anxious, uncertain gaze of the men who had gone to sleep the night before. It was a calm, steady, and deeply ancient gaze. It was a gaze that was filled with a cold, clear, and infinitely patient intelligence. It was the gaze of a being that had waited for 4,000 years, and was, at last, awake again. He smiled at his reflection. It was his own mouth, his own lips, his own teeth. But the smile was not his. It was a slow, subtle, and deeply confident smile, a smile of quiet, absolute, and total victory. The ancient Sumerian tablet had not been an instruction manual on how to stop the world. It had been a key. And the lock it opened was not the universe. It was the human mind. The final, terrible, and beautifully elegant truth of the matter finally, and with a profound, internal, and deeply satisfying sense of homecoming, settled into his new, and infinitely more spacious, consciousness. The tablet had not been an instruction. It had been an invitation. And he, at last, was home.